There's no question that Sigmund Freud is one of the most controversial figures in the field of psychology. He would argue, for example, that if you bite your nails or you smoke cigarettes excessively, that the problem stems from breastfeeding issues during infancy. Or as a young boy, you have this irrational fear that your father's going to come along and just castrate you, right? So if Freud's ideas are so out there, why do we still talk about him? It's because when you take a step back, his ideas as a whole provide a really unique window or perspective to explain behavior, mental illness, or in this video, personality development. So in order to understand the id, the ego, and the superego and how it shapes our personality, let's first start with this kind of bigger idea, this big perspective of what Freud is thinking. And we're going to use this iceberg as a great metaphor to explain these layers. Why? Because like our mind, according to Freud, we have different layers. We have the top layer above the water, right? This kind of thin slice of an iceberg. But the majority of an iceberg, right? The big volume and mass of an iceberg is hidden beneath the surface, right below. And this is kind of the metaphor that Freud would use for how the mind works. So the top of the iceberg is what Freud would label as the conscious mind, okay? The conscious mind. So what does this consist of? This consists of everything that you're currently thinking about right now, right? So this consists of our thoughts, right? What are you thinking about today and tomorrow? What are you doing? How are you feeling? Our memories, right? Thinking about yesterday, thinking about past birthday parties. Our desires, right? Maybe you want to have a certain job when you grow up, or even our emotions and feelings, right? So our conscious mind represents everything that we are aware of, like our thoughts, our memories, and our desires, which means below the surface is something different. Freud will label this as our unconscious mind. What is it? Our unconscious mind, right? And this is the part of our mind that he would argue shapes our behavior, controls our actions, but yet we have no conscious awareness of. We have no idea what is down here, but yet shapes our external world, right? Shapes our behavior. Now, if the unconscious mind was filled with pleasant things, right? Happy memories, great thoughts, unicorns and rainbows, well, life would be pretty good. Unfortunately, and this is central to Freud's idea, a lot of the things that happen in life are anxiety triggering and emotional and traumatic. And what do we do with those things? So, for example, when it comes to our thoughts, many of our thoughts are intrusive, right? Things that we don't want to have, right? Hurting other people, hurting ourselves, right? Thinking bad things. Or memories. Of course, we have happy memories, but a lot of memories deal with trauma, right? And Freud would say a lot of them are sexual memories that happen in childhood. Or desires, like we have good desires. Maybe you have a job or a career you want to have, but desires can also be taboo, right? And you know Freud loved to talk about things sexual, right? We have sexual fantasies and there's things that we want to do, but they are socially unacceptable. And when it comes to our emotions, yes, there's joy and happiness, but what if we have rage and we have hate in our mind, right? And all of these things in our conscious mind, we don't want to have because it's not going to lead to healthy living. So what happens? Well, Freud would argue that we employ a defense mechanism, kind of like a bulletproof vest for our mind, our conscious mind, called repression. What is it called? Repression, right? You repress. And what this refers to is that we unconsciously, okay, unconsciously meaning we don't even know we're doing it, push down or block out these thoughts, memories, and desires, right? We push them below the surface because they are too painful to think about. So all of these, right? All of these thoughts and memories, all these dots represent all of these traumatic incidences, all these anxieties pushed down into our unconscious. So according to Freud, our unconscious isn't this happy thing. It's full of really dark stuff, but yet shapes our behavior. So this is fundamental to Freud's ideas. All right, so now we get into the id, the ego, and the superego. And these three forces, we'll think of these not as parts like the amygdala or hippocampus, they're kind of forces or energies, interact with each other. And think about how they're having to navigate all of these, traumatic stuff as well. So it's very hard for them. So here's what I want you to know. First, the id. The id is entirely in our unconscious mind. Okay, where is it? In our unconscious. And the reason that's important is because the ego and the superego kind of float between the conscious and unconscious, but the id is only solely in our unconscious mind. Also, it's what we are born with. So thinking about a baby is all id. We'll talk about that. And it's driven by primal drives. primal or animalistic drives or instincts. Okay? And why is this important? I know we're a very smart species, right? We're very intelligent. But at the core of the problem is that we still have kind of a caveman brain, right? We have an animal brain. We just are driven towards things that immediately bring us pleasure. We want food, we want water, we want warmth, we want sex, we want just these kind of animalistic things that drive our behavior. So inevitably, we're kind of just primal. And the thing to think about is, how do we deal with these primal drives, right? How do we be in the 21st century but have this kind of caveman brain of thirst, water, sex, right? We'll dive into that as well. Now, Freud actually breaks down our drives into two different types. One is about life and survival that he calls eros, right? They're all driven to survive and reproduce and live and be joyful. This is very pleasant, right? But as he watched the atrocities of World War I and realized that there's so much destruction in the world, that we don't just have eros, this life instinct, but we also have something called the death instinct that he called thanatos, right? Thanatos. And if you think, we don't have a death instinct, well, then why do we engage in self-destructive behavior, right? I'm sure many of us do things we probably shouldn't do, skydiving and drug abuse, but yet we do it anyways. So we have eros and thanatos driving us as well. And because we're driven by instincts and urges that make us feel good, Freud would argue that the id is guided by what he calls the pleasure principle, right? All these urges that make us feel good and seek pleasure. The pleasure principle. So think about things that you would do that would fall in this category, right? Eating the extra slice of chocolate cake, or scrolling in social media, or procrastinating to finish an assignment, right? If it feels good, we're more likely to do it. And we don't wait, right? We want to do it now, right? We call this in psychology immediate gratification. I cannot wait for this pleasure. I need it in this moment. Gratification, right? And at the heart, you see this little lightning bolt here? What is guiding our id is what Freud would call the libido. Now, libido is Latin for desire. And we think about libido today, we might think of sexual drive, right? But Freud didn't necessarily mean it all about sex. Basically, he's arguing that there's kind of this force, this kind of fuel that's guiding our drives and our pleasure principles and all this kind of, I need it now, right? This is what he means by libido. Now, there's something I want you to pay attention to under the word id, and that's the word it. Why do I have that? It's because Freud never actually used the words id, ego, and superego. And that might be traumatizing for some of you who know anything about the id, ego, and superego in Freud itself. Freud spoke German, so everything we know about Freud and we're reading about him has been translated. The original translation of id was es in German, das es, which means it. That is a much better way to explain what the id does, because it represents this thing, right? It's non-gender, it's not a boy, it's not a girl, it's just this baby, right? It's this thing that just acts. It's illogical, right? It's when we talk about baby, like what's its name, right? It's illogical, it's irrational, it doesn't think about the consequences of its actions, it just cries whenever it wants to cry, it doesn't care that mom and dad are sleeping and need the rest. This is a much better way to think about it. All right, so now that we have the id, how do we keep the id in check? We can't just go around eating whatever we want and stealing whatever we want and hitting somebody in the face because we don't like them, or telling our boss we don't like them, or falling asleep during a meeting, right? We have to make sure that the id stays in check. What does that? This is the ego. And instead of it, the ego is translated to ich, German for I. This is yourself. This is you, right? This is the decisions that you make in life, is your ego. And as opposed to the id, which is entirely in the conscious, the ego kind of floats between conscious life, the external world, and the unconscious. So what do we need to know about the id? Well, the id, as opposed to the pleasure principle, acts on what we call the reality principle, right? In other words, it takes reality into account. I can't just do or think whatever I want, right? There are consequences for my actions. I live, right? We live in a society, okay? I have relationships with people. I have a job. I have a family. I can't just act on every impulse, right? There are social norms to follow, right? There are rules as a student, right? There are laws. I can't just drive 150 miles an hour because I want to drive fast, right? So whenever it comes to the ego, it's the idea that I need to constrain the id and make sure it understands that we do live in the real world. So inevitably, what does the ego do? It's the moderator. What does it moderate? It makes sure that the id gets what it wants, but in small doses, right? Or I can hold it back just a little bit. In his writings, Freud talks about a great analogy of a horse and a horseback rider. And what he says is basically the ego, okay, is the rider, and the id is the horse, right? This is the moderator, right? It's like you're kind of holding on for dear life. The id's kind of doing its thing, and the ego's like, no, 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 we can't do that, right? We can't snooze all day. We can't eat everything we want. We can't just hurt other people. So that's a wonderful kind of analogy to think about the id and the ego. All right. Lastly, it's important to know the id still has to achieve what it wants. If it doesn't, you're going to have a lot of anxiety if you can't get pleasure. So instead of immediate gratification, we are going to get a gratification, but we have to delay it. So this is delayed gratification. Okay? Delayed, that's gratification. So we are going to achieve, right, what the id wants, but we have to understand the constraints of the external world. Now, before we get to the superego, the ego, the I, the ich, has one more trick up its sleeve. If it is having trouble controlling the demands, desires, instincts of the id, it can employ defense mechanisms. And we'll talk about those in another video. But one of those defense mechanisms is one we're going to talk about, which is repression. In other words, when the id is rising to the surface, it wants pleasure, and it wants desires, it wants sex, it wants whatever it wants. There's kind of this mechanism, this barrier that prevents these thoughts from getting to the top. So the ego can employ different defense mechanisms to stop it. Now, do these rise to the surface by accidents? Well, Freud would say they do. So, for example, I kind of love these examples, but sometimes these kind of intrusive memories or intrusive thoughts, traumatic memories, taboo desires, sometimes they do rise to the surface. Right? Sometimes they do. And Freud would say, well, how do I know that they rose to the surface, by accident? Well, they come in many forms. Freud would say, for example, our dreams, right? If you dream about hurting your boss, you really want to hurt your boss, right? That was kind of an unconscious desire that kind of slipped through the cracks. Or maybe slips of the tongue, right? Maybe you want to break up in a relationship and you call your girlfriend or boyfriend by the wrong name, right? Like, oh, I didn't mean to say that. But Freud would say you did mean to say that was an unconscious desire that slowly rose to the top. So when it comes to psychoanalysis and therapy, the goal is actually to get these things to the surface, but sometimes they can go through. All right, now if the world was just the ego controlling the demands of the external world and id, things would be okay. But there's a third factor. By the time a child's about 5 years old, they develop what Freud would call a superego. This is the judge. This is the, okay, ego, you got to stay in check. I know you're trying to fulfill the demands of the id, but if you do too much id, you're going to be in trouble. So the superego, I'm going to erase this, acts instead of our pleasure principle and our reality principle, essentially our moral compass, our moral principle, right? What is the right thing to do? Okay? And according to Freud, this essentially becomes our conscience, right? Of right and wrong and morality and making sure that we live up to societal standards. And essentially why this is a problem, will eventually be a problem, is that we're internalizing the voice. We internalize the voice of authority figures. So who would be an authority figure? Our parents, our teachers, right? Anybody that we think would judge us, right? And because we internalize the voice of those authority figures, we have this kind of ideal self, right? Our ego ideal. This is totally illogical. It's a part of us that we're never going to achieve, right? It's like this angel, this perfect, virtuous person that we're never going to achieve. So it's the person not you are, but the person you ought to be. Okay, you ought to be. So if we think about kind of a real life example, you see like an A+ here. The id would say, don't study, go have fun, go hang out with friends, go do some things out, go scroll on social media for a while. Your ego's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We have the reality here. You got a test tomorrow. You got to make sure at least you study for a few hours. And then your superego's like, okay, not only do we need to study, but we need an A, right? Because we're told by society we must be perfect, and our parents tell us you must be perfect, and it's the judge and executioner. So what's the problem with that? Well, if you don't live up to this standard, this is the seat of developing things like shame, right? I didn't live up to the standard, or guilt, right? And this would make you, from a personality perspective, if you have a very strong superego, you're just going to walk around feeling like you're never good enough, right? And you feel guilty all the time, and you're never going to do anything pleasurable because you feel guilty. Ooh, it's taboo to do certain things, right? So this would be our kind of an overactive superego. And if we go back to our translation, superego translates to German, which means over-I or Über-Ich. And this makes so much more sense than using the phrase superego, because the idea of the superego is that you have this virtuous, idealized version of yourself that is so above, right, over what you can achieve, there's no way you're going to satisfy it. And you're going to end up feeling guilt, shame, and just tremendous anxiety for living up to that perfection. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you got a better insight into Freud's entire psychoanalytic theory, and also how our personality can develop from the id, the ego, and the superego. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.